Begin Self-Publishing episode 121. Talking about my books for a change.
Interested in self-publishing but don't know where to start? Want to get your book onto Amazon? Want to hold your paperback book in your hands? Learn how on the Begin Self-Publishing podcast with your host, Tim Lewis.
The next two shows I am going to be doing, including this one, are going to be solo shows where I talk about some shorter issues. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I'm slightly pressed for time as I'm going on a long trip to the United States of America. I'm going to go to San Diego for Social Media Marketing World. I'm going to briefly go to Wichita because I know a few people there, and I'm going to be appearing on a live Facebook Live show, hopefully on the day when this show airs. And I'm also going to be going to Austin for South by Southwest, and then very briefly to New York. And because that's 3.5 weeks of journeying, these shows have got to be done in the few days before I head off. And I don't really want to do a show with a guest in it when I'm away because I can't promote the show in the same way. And it doesn't feel fair to do shows where you've got a guest and you're not doing your standard procedures of working through all of the places you should be sharing the actual individual show. So I thought I'd do two shorter solo shows. And have them ready for you for those 2 weeks. I should be back in the UK by the next show, though it's very tight. I think I'll be extremely jet lagged. So I'm recording this show and I'll be recording the other show after this. So anyway, I thought I'd do a show where I actually talk about my books. It's something that has occurred to me, and it's probably obvious to most of you who've listened to this podcast. I very rarely actually ever talk about my books. And I think it's a kind of variation of the imposter syndrome. I lost confidence in my books. I lost confidence in my fiction writing ability. I've always been confident in that I'm good at interviewing people. I've been confident that I can talk about marketing topics, but I lost confidence in how good my books were. The funny thing is, I actually, almost accidentally, because I had an issue with my headphones, so I couldn't listen to any podcasts for a little while, and I started rereading my own book, my first Time Shock book, Time Shock, I Want My Life Back. And when I was rereading it, I was thinking, this is actually a lot better than I remember. I've always been a little bit ashamed of that first book. Basically a 25,000 word time travel ebook. There are 3 books in that series. I seem to have done trilogies. In both cases, I was hoping to do long series because it's a rather sensible, commonly known thing. It's a lot easier to sell and make money from books in a long series than it is to make it money from individual books. So, yes, as I say, I started to reread Time Shock, I Want My Life Back, and actually thinking, oh, this is quite a good book. I really enjoy reading this. I think the biggest issue I had with that book, and that is actually historically by far the best performing book I've had. That got to number 10 in the UK time travel chart, which may not sound that impressive, but actually, because time travel is such a strange category, I think I should be proud that I got to number 10 in the UK chart. I think I could have got into the US chart as well if I hadn't made a rather slightly stupid mistake with my targeting, where at one point I was spending money on Facebook adverts for people in the US and then sending them accidentally to the UK Amazon store. But that's a whole nother story. And the reason why getting to number 10 in a time travel chart is good is because it is a pure action time travel story. It appeals to people who like the more sciencey side of time travel. It's not at all descriptive. It's much more in the fast-moving, paced kind of novel. There are a few little continuity and other errors in the book. Not that many, and time travel is a really hard genre to get right. The reason why it's actually very hard to chart highly to get to, say, to number 1 in the time travel chart is that if you ever look at the time travel charts, and I haven't recently, but if you do, you'll see that there's an awful lot of time travel romance in there. Now, if you're up against romance books, then you're always going to be struggling because the market for romance is so much bigger than that for the specialist time travel area. And there are so many cases of the kind of Outlander and that kind of story where people go back in time and then cast a romance with some husky person from Scotland or some other place. And if you're ever writing a time travel book, you're going to have to compete with time travel romance stories. The other interesting facet of time travel, which again I didn't really appreciate until I wrote a time travel book, was that in time travel, there are almost a few subgenres. There's whole historical time travel, which is again more like historical fiction. So rather than writing just a standard historical fiction book, where you go into great detail describing what all of the things look like in that particular time. And I mean, I've got a lot of time for historical fiction. It's not something I really want to write, though. They write it in a time travel context. And again, this means that they can put it in a time travel category and in historical fiction. That is the total opposite of my book, which is really more like a thriller set with time travel, quite a lot of time travel elements. My stories are very pure time travel, much more of the science fiction short story time travel, which is what I've read a lot of in terms of time travel. I've read a lot of anthologies of short time travel stories. This was kind of my response on the same genre. When I was writing the first book, I suffered from a problem of wanting it to be of a particular length. If I'd just written the book as I should have written it, it would have been about 9,000 words long. But because I thought that it has to be over 20,000 for anybody to be able to buy it or read it or do anything with it, because to get up to novella length, I added a whole extra weird section with aliens in the middle of it. So it kind of, I think actually reading it again, it works okay, but I can see, and I have had bad reviews because it kind of starts out as a psychological and a question about realism, and then there's a whole weird section with aliens in the middle of it. Now, the aliens actually come back in some of the later books, and I make a lot better use of that sort of future part of it. And you could say that there is no problem with time travel having both a historical and a future section to it. Well, I can understand why some people wouldn't like that. And I added in purely that section to try and pad it out to make it up to 20,000 words. Maybe in retrospect, I should have just finished the original book I was doing and sold it even at like 8,000, maybe as a short story. Because the books ended up as free anyway. You can go onto Amazon and look up Time Shop, I Want My Life Back, and you can download it free on Amazon. It's basically a free first in series. The other thing I would say about having free books is that while it's great for getting people to download the book, you get an awful lot of people who will download the book and then will complain that it wasn't what they were expecting. When if they were actually spending money on it, they would make the effort to do things like read reviews and read the description. And rather than just complaining about it, they would have actually just not bought it, and then they're not going to leave a bad review. So that's an issue with having a free book. And it's why I've not yet made my Magpies and Magic first book free. I probably will do as an ebook some stage. But I'm just worried, as it's not got that many reviews at the moment, that I don't want to sabotage it by making it free and then having a whole load of people saying it's not long enough or something along those lines, or some spurious reason why they don't like the book. The second book in the Time Shock series is actually my favourite book in terms of those I've written. It's slightly longer in the time. The first book has an awful lot of very short time jumps in it. It's all about time travel, and it can be quite confusing to some people. I mean, it was confusing to me to write it. I think if you like time travel and you like complexity, then the first book will really appeal. If you're somebody who is expecting like some sort of single time travel jump and then you want to know what's going on, you may be confused by the first book. The second book is longer and it's basically about what happens when somebody goes back in time and changes a major aspect of history. The first book is very much more about a few people's personal journey and when they change their own life accidentally in the past. Well, the second book is more about when somebody goes back and changes a major piece of history and what happens there. And there's also like a whole whodunit kind of theme on the second book, which may be a suggestion that maybe at some point I should write a murder mystery. Though, given my slow pace of writing a book a year, and I'm currently writing a non-fiction book, I'm not sure when I'm ever going to get round to writing a murder mystery book. My third Time Shock book kind of finishes up the series in a reasonable way. It's much more of a book about finishing the series. I mean, I'm struggling to remember a lot about my third Time Shock book. I know that some people like it and some people don't like it. I think it tied up all the loose ends in the whole of the rest of the series pretty well. But what I would say is that I know that some people found it a bit complicated. It's a lot more aliens in the third book than there are in any other series. But it does tie up a lot of the loose ends. In fact, it ties up all the loose ends. I actually had a review of the third book saying that I'd clearly taken a 60,000 word book and sliced it up into 3 and then moaning about that. And even though that's not true, I didn't. I wrote them as separate books. I actually took that as a compliment. The fact that they couldn't tell that I had clearly been struggling to try and make the narrative make sense across the books. I actually thought, well, the fact that they thought that I'd written it as one book and split it up was actually an unintentional compliment. And I found that quite amusing in a way. So all those 3 books are all ebooks. I should probably get round to doing a compendium paperback version of the Time Shock series. Because it's long enough as a whole to do a paperback, but I just haven't done that. Slightly on a whim, and because I thought it would be easier, I decided to switch to fantasy. Now, I think in hindsight, switching to fantasy was a mistake. Firstly, because even though I really love fantasy, I love watching fantasy TV series and fantasy film, I don't really read that much fantasy. I find most fantasy overly long and a bit tedious to read. So I've kind of written like 3 fantasy comic alternative universe books that don't really fit into any category. Most people really like them who read them, but it's hard to describe. I couldn't bring across any audience I had from any of the other books. And while they're longer, they're like all 50,000 words, and they are available as paperback. It was probably a mistake to switch to fantasy. I should have just stuck with science fiction at least. You kind of fool yourself in that even though Amazon lumps together science fiction and fantasy as one kind of area, they are very different in terms of who reads them. I think, generally speaking, you're going to get a lot of people who like science fiction, who like fantasy, and vice versa. But in terms of readers, it's very different to read space opera than epic fantasy. So that was a bit of a mistake. The basic thrust of my Magpies and Magic series is that there's 3 magpies from basically our universe, giving away a bit of a spoiler for the books here, who get transported into a world where they're much, much bigger relative to the humans in that world. The humans they're about the size of a horse in this other universe, where magic still exists. And they actually some of them have magical powers in this new universe. It's also based on the premise that there aren't really heroes. There are people thrust into heroic situations. It's all about the journey of Colin, who's a hero who accidentally becomes known as a sort of a mega hero, even though he's totally incompetent, he's useless as a hero. And the main party of people who, on the quest that they go on, including the Magpies, are actually all fairly useless as being what you would call traditional fantasy heroes. I also, perhaps controversially, decided to have some lesbian characters in the Magpies and Magic series. It's not because I did this for any great political correctness reason. It was just because I'm tired of the usual fantasy trope of having a princess who has some romance with a male hero. So I decided to have a princess who has a romance with a female hero instead. I'm sure anybody who actually is a proper lesbian would say that I write them all the lesbian characters terribly, and I'm not being consistent in how lesbian romance works. And they're probably exactly correct. But I actually do think, I thought there would be a lot more fuss from people about this. But honestly, I can say that nobody seems to care. Nobody seems to care at all that I have lesbian characters in my books. And I suppose that's actually quite a good thing. I've also, in all of my books, I seem to, even though I'm not particularly anti-religious or particularly religious, I always seem to end up writing about religious themes quite a lot in all of my books. Not so much that I criticise religion, but I do criticise, for example, these religions where they all go on about minor details. So in my Magpies and Magics books, one of the largest things that I talk about is that there are two sects of the same religion where they're debating about whether the prophet wore socks or not when he's one of his journeys through history. And that's the main difference between the two religions. But yet they're always greatly fighting each other. So I've done 3 books in the Magpies and Magic series. That series is now complete as well. My latest project is completely different. I did briefly describe it at the start of a previous show. What I'm going to do, and this comes back to my own experience with social media. I love social media marketing. I love social media. I'm on it way more than I should be for somebody who's trying to sell books. I've not been that great at selling books through social media, but I've made some fantastic connections. I've got all sorts of people. I've got connections with bloggers, with thousands or even millions of people who read their stuff. I've connected with authors all across the world. I've got a job from social media, a couple of jobs from social media, only part-time ones, mine, but I've got a speaking gig purely from social media. And that kind of intrigued me. So originally I was just going to write a book where I said, how I think you can use social media to get ahead in your own career or your own business or find a job and this kind of thing. And I was talking to one of the guests of the show who said, well, if you need any case studies, and this kind of light bulb in my head went off and I thought, case studies. So I put up a Facebook post on my personal profile. I've got a lot of friends on Facebook. Some of them are people I know well, some I've never met. I'm perfectly willing to say that. I've not got too many fake friends on Facebook, thankfully. So I put a post onto Facebook and I was expecting 3 or 4 replies. I think I had 37 replies from people volunteering to be interviewed for this book. So the book's kind of become a interview-based book. Now, I was really hoping to have maybe got the book finished by now. I've done most of the interviews. There's a few people I'm still chasing. But things come up and I've got conferences and I've got my mega trip but I will finish the book. I'll finish the book probably sometime in the middle of this year. I'll do my 1 book a year policy. And I have a feeling that because of the interest in the topic, because everybody seems to be obsessed with social media for selling and for marketing, when the basic power to me, in my mind, the social media is the connections. It's making those connections with people. That's where the power is. When I was growing up and when I started in business, if you wanted to get ahead in your job, you really had to know the right people. So you had to go down the pub and hobnob with the senior people, or you had to play golf with the boss, or you had to marry the boss's daughter or something along those lines. Now you can use social media. You can use social media to go connect with people in your own company, connect with people at other companies at higher levels. And it's leveled up the playing field. Because much as we would like to think that if you work hard and you're very good, you'll get success, there is some truth in that, but a lot of it is making people aware of that. It's no good working really hard under a boss who doesn't appreciate you and expecting that to be worth something. You've got to be making connections with people in similar or higher levels at other similar companies so that you've got somewhere to go and connections to make. You may be able to find somebody who you really click with at a different company, and they may have a job opportunity open, and you'll be the first to know because you're their friend, because you've made friends with them on social media. And this is kind of the crux. And there's so many stories of people I've interviewed who have got job offers or they've got speaking gigs, and it all because they've known somebody on social media. So that's the crux to my book, which at the moment it's going to be called The Real Social Advantage. Originally I was going to call it Social Power, but there's problems with the domain name for that, and also the fact that it sounds a bit naff. So at the moment it's going to be called The Real Social Advantage. It may change. So that's more or less my book writing career. And as I say, the first Time Shop book is free on Amazon if you're looking for time travel. The first Magpie's Magic book is 99 cents, the ebook. It's quite considerably more for the paperback, and that's just because it costs a lot of money to actually produce the paperback. I make about as much money from the paperback sales as I make from the 99 cent ebook, which suggests how unprofitable paperbacks are relative to ebooks. If you follow my Stone and Press Twitter account, you'll see when my Real Social Advantage book is out, because I'll be tweeting about it a lot. I'll probably mention it on this show, just to let you know. And yes, that's my book career. So talk to you guys next week.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please stop by iTunes and rate and leave a review. This helps make the show more visible. For free resources, show notes, and other helpful content, join the community at beginselfpublishing.com.